Hi there. Welcome to our second session in the Best Practices Handbook review. This is a webinar that will be every other month throughout the year where we spend time going through sections of the Best Practices Handbook for staff who are unfamiliar or who would like to review things that they may have forgotten about. As a reminder, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the Best Practices Guide is and what it's not. It is meant to assist libraries in training and operations. It's a support system and a reference for staff using the ILS and delivery. And it's a living document under constant review by the Best Practices Committee, which is appointed by the Net Southwest Directors Council. The Best Practices Guide is not intended to replace or hinder local control. It's definitely not an encyclopedia of every circumstance that libraries may encounter, and it's not a comprehensive training manual for staff. Instead, see it as guidelines and ways to streamline your service so that the patron experience is consistent and positive. To review from last time, we did an overview of the rules versus recommendations in the Best Practices Handbook. We went through section 1, which is cataloging, acquisitions, and holdings, including barcode placement, bib records, and adding and deleting holdings for your library's materials. And we also started the chapter on circulation, including placing and filling reserves and problem item forms. If you'd like to review anything from that session, we do have a recording available on our website or on our YouTube channel. Let's move on now and continue down through the chapter on circulation. We're going to start with how to block reserves. So for those libraries who have items that they are not ready to send out in delivery or who aren't ready to send it to fill reserves at all, there are some ways to do that. If it's a new item, you can use the newly acquired location in your library, and this may be used for the first 2 months that a library owns an item. That requirement is flexible in that if there is an item that is in constant demand for longer than 2 months or which has had a resurgence in extreme popularity, you can use newly acquired for short periods to manage holds in your own library. But this should be used limited times, not for years or not even for 6 to 10 months. 2 months is the guideline. And after that, they should be moved into regular circulation and shared throughout SWLS. If you have items that are inaccessible because they're in your basement or in a storage room, or because they are otherwise unavailable for use altogether, use the status or the location of storage. And if you need help moving things into those locations or statuses, you can ask SWLS for guidance. If it is a non-circulating item, make sure that your collection rules or parameters are that they are non-circulating items. If they cannot be sent in transit because they're delicate, bulky, or otherwise can't be sent safely in delivery, speak with SWLS about the best ways to ensure that that happens. For the most part, it's important to know that our system operates efficiently because libraries freely share their materials. So we encourage you to share as much of your collection as you can at all times. Let's move on to reserve limits and checkout and renewal periods and limits. Reserve limits get to be set at the local level, and you can choose reserve limits for each patron category that you have. So resident adults, resident juveniles, institutions, educator cards, they can all have different reserve limits. And your library should have a policy about how you deal with that. Checkout and renewal periods are also set locally, but libraries may override checkout periods on items if they are checked out at your location. So if your patron would like to borrow something from another library and your policy says you check things out for 4 weeks, you may override the owning library's policy and set that due date for 4 weeks. So you have to do that on a one by one basis. So each time this happens, you'll have to manually set and override those checkout periods, but you are allowed to do that on all items checked out in your location. You should, however, always respect renewal limits that are set by owning libraries. So if they say there are 2 renewals, you should not exceed that number for your patron. Instead, ask them to return it or ask them to reach out directly to the owning library. I also want to address why we don't allow automatic renewals. That is a feature in Verso that exists. However, the federal and state definition of circulation disallows automatic renewals. So we wouldn't be able to count them for annual report. And circulation dictates county reimbursement, so there is a financial implication to allowing them. Since we cannot separate out automatic renewals in our statistics, we are not allowed to use that feature in Verso. So patrons can request renewals by calling or stopping in at the library. They can also renew their materials online individually, and those are all allowable renewals for circulation purposes. But we cannot turn on automatic renewals because it would skew our data and it would mean that we don't have accurate numbers for county reimbursement purposes. Let's talk a little bit about fines and charges. Libraries get to set their own fine schedules. And while most of our libraries no longer charge overdue fines, we do still have some libraries that do. So libraries set their own fine schedules. If your library doesn't charge fines, you should routinely waive fines that accrue at your location from items that are borrowed from libraries which do charge fines. So if your patron checks out materials in your location, you can waive any fines that accrue on items checked out at your location. But you should not waive fines that accrue at other locations. And you can see checkout library in that fines and payments screen in Verso. So you should be able to see where that transaction took place. Another thing that's really important for user experience is that users should be informed of their fines, regardless of your own library's policy. So if a library user comes into your library and has a fine balance, even if you don't plan to charge them for it, you should let them know that it exists so that they're not surprised or offended when they go to a different library and it's brought up. If those fines are accrued from your location and you don't charge fines, again, you can waive those fines to get them out of their account. But if there are fines on the account, you should always let them know. If a patron would like to pay fines and you don't collect fines, you can collect that money and send it to the library where the transaction took place. And you can do that by including an item payment form that you can find on our website or you can find on our library profiles page. That item payment form is shown here on the screen. And it can also be used for paying for lost materials and things like that. Let's talk a little bit about materials that are overdue and how libraries should deal with those. The first thing that should happen is that all libraries should be running overdue reports, even if you don't send them to patrons. If your library just calls people, that's fine. But you should be running those overdue reports so that you know what's overdue. And it helps with respecting other libraries' materials so that you don't have patrons holding on to things that don't belong to you for extended periods of time. Items that are 90 or more days overdue automatically move to patron lost by policy. Your library might move them to lost sooner than that, some as soon as 30 days overdue, and that's totally fine. But 90 days is the limit at which that material automatically will move to patron lost. And I set up those reports to help all libraries manage their materials more efficiently. Due diligence is always requested when following up on lost items that were checked out in your library. So please follow up with those things and attempt to recover them so that libraries aren't waiting on materials that are just sitting out at a patron's house or something like that. There is a claims returned button on every item in a patron account, but items may only be marked claims returned by the owning library. And checkout libraries need to contact owning libraries if necessary before moving something into claims return. And this is in an effort to make sure that owning libraries understand what's going to happen. Claims returned is something that some libraries ultimately charge patrons for, and some libraries do not. And because of those policy differences, only the owning library should be marking things claims returned so that they can follow their own policy for recovering their cost for that material if they choose. Lost item fees are a user's responsibility, not the library's responsibility. So if your patron loses somebody else's items, you do not have to pay that other library for the material. Your patron needs to pay that. This is different with WSCAT or SIL ILL materials. In those cases, the library is responsible from the time it was shipped out from the owning library to the time it arrives back at that library for check-in. So in statewide ILL, your library is fiscally responsible for that material. But in SWLS materials, your user is ultimately fiscally responsible. And remember that item payment forms and instructions should be followed when those interlibrary payments occur. A lot of times this starts with a conversation with the owning library, and the instructions are really good step-by-step, like who you talked to, how you decided on the cost, things like that. So please use that form, include it with any payments, and make sure you're talking to that library. I know that it sometimes feels hard to get in touch with another library and go through all of that when you have a patron standing in front of you, but it is important so that we're respecting all of our libraries' individual local policies. All right, let's talk a little bit about user account messages, notes, and comments. These are the things that you can access either in the notes area of the patron account or in the patron edit screen under messages, notes, or comments. Libraries should make sure that they include initials, dates, and as much information as possible surrounding these messages. Messages are the ones that pop up on your screen when you enter a patron account, and they're the most effective, especially for communicating with other libraries who may not know the patron or the situation. So those messages pop up and you need to click through them to get to the patron account. Notes and comments do not, but they are still readable to the other libraries. So these are better for internal communications in your library or things that are kind of not essential to read upon entry into the patron account. The one thing that you should always do is honor blocks that are placed on accounts by other libraries. So if a library places a block on a patron, either contact that library or have the patron contact that library in order to find a resolution before you allow checkouts. This is important because there are oftentimes individual issues or individual concerns before a checkout takes place. Let's move on to Chapter 3 in the Best Practices Guide. And this one is all surrounding library cards and user accounts. The sections in this chapter include issuing cards, replacement and forgotten cards, expired accounts, entering user information, information about outreach events and digital card applications or self-registration, card sharing and multiple cards for patrons, institutional and educator cards, and last but not least, staff accounts and security rules. First up is the basics of issuing a library card. Before entering a new user into the ILS, you should always search for duplicates. You might even check previous addresses or maiden names or married names, just to see if there's a possible duplicate before entering a new patron. Libraries should also issue a physical card to users. Normally, you're going to do that right in person as they're applying. You may have an exception for some situations in which you might need mailing proof or you might need to mail them the card for some reason. But those are really exceptions rather than the norm. Normally, a patron who comes in for a library card should leave with a physical card. Residents of SWLS can receive cards by applying in person or by mail at any library in the system. So they do not need to come to the library in the service area that they live. They can go to any library in SWLS and receive a library card. Out of state or temporary residents should receive out of state or temporary cards. And those are the green cards or the orange cards. And we have a workflow in the Best Practices Handbook that you can look up to follow and figure out which type of card is appropriate for that patron. Local access out-of-state cards may have a fee if your library has a fee for that type of card, but system-wide access for out-of-state residents comes with a $100 fee that is sent to SWLS, and that covers things like delivery costs if they're using other libraries' materials. It covers some of the costs associated with offering them digital access to our online resources, and any other incidentals that comes with using our entire system. You may also have local fees that you charge for that card. The biggest thing is that it has a 1-year expiration date, and they are listed as out-of-state patrons with an out-of-state library card number. The limitations on those out-of-state cards include that they will not have access to Badger Link from home, although they can access it anytime inside your library. They also will not have access to Overdrive or Libby, and that is a statewide rule based on our license agreement with Libby. If you need help explaining why out-of-state residents may not pay for Overdrive or Libby access in our system, you can reach out to SWLS, and we have a handout as well as some really good language to help you explain to those patrons, because I know it's a really attractive resource that people want, but we're not allowed to sell access to it to out-of-state patrons. All right, let's talk about replacement and forgotten library cards. Replacement cards can be issued by your library according to your own library policy, and you can set a fee for those replacements, or you can decide not to set a fee. Your library is paying for the cards, so it's up to you how to issue them. The one thing that I will say is that when you replace a lost library card or a damaged library card or whatever, you should always verify account information, including their address, contact information, email, and their notification preferences. It's just a good opportunity, since you're going into that patron edit screen anyway, to make sure everything's in order. Also, you'll want to ask that library patron if they use Overdrive and Libby, because if they do, they may want their old and new cards to be merged in the Overdrive marketplace so that they don't lose their holds or checkouts or their place in line for anything. Individual libraries can also have a policy about whether a physical card is required for checkout at their library, or what alternatives exist, like if they need to show an ID or if they need to have it on their phone, or what the rules are about checking out without a library card. So make sure that your library has a policy, and make sure that all of your staff is following that policy, so there's a consistent experience at your location for patrons who use your materials. Next up is expired account. And the biggest thing about expired accounts is that libraries should be creating accounts for no more than 3 to 5 year expirations, so that they are expiring on a regular basis and being verified regularly. The state encourages libraries to be doing a full patron audit every 3 years, and having accounts expire in that time encourages us to keep up with that audit timeline. Every time you renew a patron account because of an expiration, you should be verifying all of their information, addresses, contact information, reserve notifications, and other notification preferences, and things like that. Also, always check that the township code is correct and that they are in the correct patron category. So a lot of times children will age up into the adult section. Just verify that that's correct moving forward. Expired users should be removed by libraries on a regular basis. I encourage all libraries to do an annual review of your full patron list at least once a year, to remove expired patrons or to renew those who need to be renewed. Every fall, I do go through and remove patrons according to the rules set forth by the Net Southwest Directors Council. And you can see on the screen what the stipulations are on those accounts when I delete them. So I do this every October. I give your library, usually the director, plenty of warning that it's about to happen. But I do go through all of the patrons in the entire SWLS database each year. A really important thing when you're entering a new library card, updating a library card, or even just checking the settings in a library card is to check that the township code is correct. It is the most important thing in the patron account. And this township code ties to the funding that your library receives for circulations by non-residents. So it's really, really important that we get it right, because we bill counties based on that information. And if you get it wrong, every circulation, even if you correct it later, every circulation was done when it was wrong, is then billed incorrectly. So get it right, and get it right immediately. So the first time the account is used, it should be correct. You can use myvote.wisconsin.gov. There is an address search that will help give you the township for most addresses in the state of Wisconsin. And if you can't figure out the correct township code with this, ask your director for more information. And if you still can't figure it out, ask system staff, and we'd be happy to help. Again, that township code is the single most important thing for your library's funding, and we rely on it being correct every time. There are some other things about entering user account information, and the most important thing to know is that your library should have a naming convention for all different types of cards. So if you have institution or educator cards, you should have a naming convention that is consistent, and you can easily find those types of accounts in your database. When you're entering surnames that have sometimes they are prefixed like Van Natta or Von Felt, use the user's ID for spacing and capitalization rules. And for suffixes like the third or junior or other things like that, enter those suffixes after a comma in the first name field. So the last name might be Smith and the first name is John, comma, the third. So that we have a consistency across the system for finding those patrons in case we need to look them up by name instead of barcode number. If your library does outreach events at which you issue library cards, please take a look at the best practices guide. I believe it's page 12, that there are some stipulations about outreach events. The biggest thing is that if you choose to do an outreach event, your library is responsible for the cost of library cards that are issued, even if you're issuing cards to patrons who would like other libraries to be their home library. So you can still do those events. We encourage you to do those events and get people signed up for library cards. But we do have some stipulations about having internet access so that you can check for duplicate cards before you issue the card. You can set expiration dates for a month so that that patron goes into their home library and kind of updates things, kind of like self-registration would happen. And then in the case of an outreach event where you're issuing cards to other libraries' patrons, those hard copy applications can be sent to the user's chosen home library. So for example, if Platteville is doing an event at Southwest Tech, they could ask each person where they prefer their home library to be located. And then those paper applications could be sent to those home libraries so that the home libraries have access to the information when the patron comes in to make that 30-day expiration into a 3-year expiration. Digital registration is available. We call it self-registration, and it's called self-registration in our Verso system, but it is available only for adult residents living in the SWLS service area. These self-registrations are monitored by SWLS staff on an ongoing basis, and we check that they are not duplicates so that they don't already have a library card in our system. We check that they live in our service area, and we check that they are not minors. And that's because they have access immediately to the Overdrive and Libby app, and we don't want to have any problems with parents being concerned about their children having unauthorized access to library materials. So only adults, only in our service area, are allowed to register online. That self-registration is valid for 30 days. If they don't visit a library in that time, their self-registration is deleted. When they do visit a library, your staff should update the account using the appropriate library card type, replacing the barcode number, checking the township code, and changing the patron category before the first checkout. Patrons who are designated self-registrations will not be allowed to check out materials. They'll have a checkout limit of 0 on all material types, so your staff will probably see a problem, and then it would be an indication that they should check that patron account and make sure that everything has been updated first. And of course, because real life is messy, there are always going to be situations where libraries have requests for two people to share a card, like maybe a husband and wife or a mother being taken care of by a son or something like that, that they would like to share a card between more than one individual. And libraries should have a local policy regarding whether that's allowed and how it works. They should also have a local policy regarding whether they allow patrons to have multiple cards. The most common reason that somebody would need more than one card would be like a child who splits time between divorced parents or other family situations in which it's not realistic for them to have only one card because the materials have to be at two different locations or there's no communication or something like that. We don't give you direct guidance, but we do say that your library should have a policy and follow that policy. If your library encounters a user with multiple accounts and it's not one of those designated times when it's supposed to be that way, you should work with any other home libraries that are involved to resolve the issue and either delete one that is not useful or merge the two accounts together. SWLS staff can merge two Verso accounts. Basically, all we need to know is that both home libraries agree that that needs to happen, and we can make it happen. And you can reach out to us anytime with questions. All right. Another thing that happens quite a bit is that institutions, organizations, and educators want special cards, not for personal use, but for institutional use. So libraries should have policies regarding who can apply for those, who can use them, and what the borrowing limitations are for them. So the big things that we care about are that whoever the fiscally responsible person is, whether that's an administrator at a school or a teacher on an educator card, or the administrator of a daycare or long-term care facility, whoever is fiscally responsible for those materials should be signing off in writing that that card can be used and by whom, and that lost and damaged materials will be paid for. So your library should have a policy about these things and how they're used. And last but not least, we have staff accounts. Staff accounts are used differently by different libraries. Some libraries have a specific staff account for each staff member. You would log in with maybe like your own personal username, like mine is Jay Brunetsky, or whatever your staff username is. Some libraries just have a staff account that everybody shares. Either way, you should know how they work and who has access to what parts of the ILS. An important part of staff user accounts is that the township code should not be the township, it should be staff or institution. And they should not be used to check materials out ever, because those checkouts won't count or shouldn't count toward your circulation totals if they're used for staff use. And staff should never use their staff accounts either for their own personal use or for Overdrive and Libby use. Instead, you should use your individual patron accounts for personal use and Overdrive and Libby use. You can use your staff account to reserve materials, like if you need something to come back to you for your own attention, or if you're gathering materials for a program or something like that. But checkouts should not happen on staff accounts. Libraries do each have an institutional account named after their library. And that one can be used for those checkouts for institutional use, like story times, or to reserve SWLS equipment. The big thing about SWLS equipment loans is that your home library needs to be headquarters in order to reserve those materials. And the reason is we don't want to send them to patrons. So only institutions that have the home library of headquarters can reserve our equipment. And so if you'd like to borrow our laptops or our Crickets or our button makers, change your institutional card to the home library of headquarters, and then you can choose your home library as the pickup location when you reserve our stuff. And that's the only way you'll be able to reserve that stuff without calling SWLS staff for help. There are some pretty important security and privacy rules for staff using the ILS. And the reason that it's so important that all staff understand this is because it's a shared database. We have 28 libraries in 31 locations. We have thousands and thousands of patrons across, and all of our staff have access to all of that information. And there's a lot of privacy concerns surrounding that. So staff should always be trained appropriately for any part of the ILS for which they have access. And they should also have some significant patron privacy training. So if your library staff need help with patron privacy training, SWLS can send you some information. But that patron privacy training is really important to protect the integrity of our ILS as a shared resource. A really important thing that was voted on by the Net Southwest Directors Council is that volunteers and board members may not have access to staff functions or permissions in Verso. They can use the catalog as a patron or as a guest, but volunteers may not use staff functions. So they can't check in, they can't check out, they can't pull holds lists that have patron information on them, things like that. They can only use the guest or patron access portions of Verso. And staff turnover happens pretty often, honestly. So anytime staff turnover happens, your Verso account should be updated. The access should be cut off for any departing staff, and all passwords that they may have had access to should be changed immediately. Another thing that I'd like to talk about for just a second is staff privacy on staff accounts. So a lot of times you're working with coworkers and you get to know people pretty well, or you get to know people at other libraries pretty well, and you just want to help them out. And maybe it's easy to go into a different patron's account and send them a reserve that you know they would like, or reserve something on their behalf on their patron account. Don't do that. Their other staff, their patron accounts should be treated with the same privacy rules as any other patron account. So please make sure that staff understand that other staff accounts, other staff's patron accounts are private and should be treated as such. If you have questions or concerns about anything in this section of the Net Southwest Best Practices Handbook, please reach out to SWLS, and I'd be happy to go through any of those sections or give you more information. You can find the full handbook online, either on the SWLS help page on your Verso staff account or in print in the green binder at your library. You can also find the Net Southwest Best Practices Handbook on our website at swls.org in the staff resources section. Next time, we will be starting with Chapter 4, Van Delivery, and I hope that you'll join us for another month of looking at the NetSW Best Practices Handbook. Thank you for your time.